we are all a little bit crazy, a little bit mad at points in areas. There is no such thing as a fully mature, fully sane human being. Hi, I'm Alain De Botton, and these are 5 ways to begin your therapeutic journey. Childhood matters. So the bad news is that there seems to be no way other than to focus on your childhood. This is really boring because our childhoods were long ago. We don't want to think that we are marionettes or puppets controlled by things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. But it does seem that human beings are massively shaped by what happens to them in the first 8, 10 years of their life. And it's a massive responsibility on all of us to try and find out what happened, and as adults to correct what went on way back then. You know, a lot of us carry with us from childhood almost scripts, you could call them, that tell us who we can love, how we should view ourselves, what we can try, what's too dangerous. And some of these scripts are up for being challenged. You know, why is it the case that we should always be with someone who can't love us back? Why is it that when we succeed, we might feel an eerie sense of danger? These are all typical scripts that many of us are carrying around because of complex situations back in the past. A really useful exercise to kind of jog our minds into remembering or feeling what they already know by an exercise that psychologists call sentence completion test. What you have to do is, without thinking too much, and it's quite key not to engage too much of your conscious brain on this, but just try and finish a little stub sentence like, my father was ... My mother made me feel ... I am ... What you tend to find is that the mind comes up with some of its deepest held ideas about who we really are and what went on. It can spare you years of therapy, very simple little exercise to just bring out of the darkness what it is you already know and feel. One way to read a lot of what people do in their life is they're trying to fix the dilemmas that their parents wrestled with. They're trying to find a solution. Maybe their father was depressed about something, about his status, about his place in the world. And a child might take on that and try and solve it for him. Very useful question when trying to understand why is someone making those choices? To think, well, what was on the plate of their parents? Because what was on the plate of your parents has a horrible habit of ending up on your plate. The least harm you can do is to know about it. So a very useful, very simple question is, what were my parents wrestling with? And how is what they wrestled with likely to have been manifest in some of the ways that they treated me? Get in touch with your true self. All of us are divided between these two rather odd-sounding entities, the true self and the false self. The true self is what you really feel and what you really want at any time. And that can include a lot of things that are socially not that acceptable. You might want to kill your boss, spit in the road, punch somebody, eat something off somebody else's plate. You know, all the things that as you get civilized, as you become a mature adult, you learn not to give expression to. There's then something called the false self, which is a kind of shell that grows up around the true self and is designed to meet the expectations of society. You've got to ask people how they are, you've got to do all those social niceties. And later on in life, the demands get ever more burdensome. You've got to look after people, you might have to manage a team, you've got to look after a family, all these things that you need to do in order to kind of belong to society. I think you can get ill from 2 ways. Either your true self has never been able to speak and to have a voice. Maybe because in the early years, your parents and the surrounding structure simply had no tolerance for those messages that you wanted to give out, but that didn't really fit everybody's agenda. You know, we all know parents who sort of discipline the child so tightly that it's not allowed ever to have a feeling that is contrary to expectations. And someone should at least have heard us. And when we don't get that, we grow up into what get called people pleasers. And you can't really long-term please everyone if all you're doing is just simply mirroring them. You need to rely on what's inside you. There can also be a problem in someone who has never learned that a false self is something that they sometimes need to put on. Someone who needs to always say the truth to everyone all the time. Being sometimes slightly fake, slightly adjusting to the needs of another person is intolerable largely because their own needs were not catered for. So you get two things, the manic rebel and the manic conformist. And you kind of want an accommodation between the two, but that means steering through the extremities of the true self and the false self. One exercise that I think is useful is to ask yourself, if there were no consequences, what I would now want to do is, if there were no consequences in relation to my partner, my boss, my friends, I would want to. It's often the fear of consequences, and it's a fear that's too overwhelming, that stifles your own relationship to yourself, that stops you from understanding your basic needs. So much happens to us every day, every minute, and we very rarely stop and sift through it and really analyze what it meant to us. So I think a very useful thing to do at the end of every day is just to sit with your feelings. Ask yourself a very simple question. What's coming up for me? It might be a regret, a feeling of envy, a sadness. Once you quieten down the hubbub of the day, the priorities that are always pressing on you, there will be a set of emotions behind the emotions that you're normally carrying. You make immense discoveries of yourself. It's such a simple thing to do, to just ask yourself, what am I really feeling? What's coming up for me? Listen to your body. So our minds are really keen to understand themselves, but they're also very squeamish minds. There's a part of us that wants to know who we are and what we're really feeling, and there's another part of us that really doesn't want to know and that locks down kind of falsity and lies. If we don't listen to our truths, those truths will be driven underground into our bodies. So our bodies become the receptacle for feelings that we have disowned. Very often, what happens to tensions that we've been unable to feel, because we don't want to experience them, is they get driven from the mind into the lower back. Or our shoulders, too, carry a lot of feelings that we have not felt. It's almost as though if you imagine the mind and the body, they're involved in a kind of complicated interplay whereby a certain truth needs to come out. If it's not going to come out through our mouths, through our conscious reason, it's going to seek expression. And if it's not given a mental expression, it will start to seek a bodily expression, which is why sometimes, we show up at the doctor and we've got an ailment and, we've got, let's say, a great tension in our stomach and the doctor can't find anything wrong with us. Really what it is a feeling that we're not giving vent to that has come to sit in our stomach. And a very simple exercise to try and think this through is to almost ask the different parts of your body what it is they might want to say if they had a voice. If my stomach could find a voice, what might it have to say? If my shoulders could express themselves, what might they want to tell the world? These things can show up in our minds as symptoms, but they could also show up in the body as symptoms. So you can get a symptom of a tension in, say, your lower back that might be a fear of a confrontation with a friend or a regret about the end of a relationship that hasn't been given airtime. The mind needs a certain amount of processing. It needs to process what has happened to it. And if you're not going to process it consciously, it will seek unconscious expression in the form of painful symptoms. Embrace therapy. So it's my belief that psychotherapy has been the most significant invention of the 20th century in terms of its power to help us to understand ourselves. Therapy is a relationship with somebody, and you might need to go through a lot of people before finding somebody who's right for you as a therapist. So don't despair too quickly. Therapy enables you to understand yourself a little bit better because you're talking with unusual concentration about yourself to someone who's listening very, very carefully and trying to make sense of your story. Notice patterns in what you're saying. And also, very crucially, people tend to do with their therapists what they do with people outside of therapy. Either no one tells them or no one's noticing or they're doing their own stuff. Therapy is a kind of controlled experiment. So for example, therapists might go, it's interesting that you keep telling me that you're boring or that you keep telling me that I don't like you and that you're a rather despicable person because I'm not seeing that. And so that could be a really wonderful chance, maybe for the first time in your life, to go, I do seem to be carrying around with me a constant sense that I'm unacceptable. Wonder where that comes from. And the wonderful thing about therapy when it works is a chance for a slightly new beginning because you've been seen by somebody else who gives you a slightly fairer way of looking at yourself than you've grown up to have because of the way that you were seen by people in your childhood. I think a lot of people who are interested in therapy have a very basic question, which is, how do I find a good one? There is no such thing as a good therapist per se. There's a good therapist for you. Use a search engine, ask friends, etc. But ultimately, it's about going into a room and having a chat and seeing if there's a good fit. I think a sign of being in the hands of a good therapist is that you start to understand more about you than if you were on your own. That there's something about this person that is helping you to understand bits of yourself that were out of reach when you were just alone in your room. That's a sign that you've got someone who's shining a spotlight at bits that you've been longing, perhaps for far too long, to get to understand. No one is normal. In the whole conversation about mental health, we sometimes want to divide the human population into the crazy ones and the sane ones. And the crazy ones are maybe going off to the asylum, they may be on heavy medication, etc. And then there's the healthy ones. I don't think that's a useful way of looking at things. I think that mental health is always on a continuum between perfect health and perfect ill health. And we're all somewhere on that spectrum, and we all move across that spectrum constantly. It's like physical health. All of us have to own up with sort of generosity, even a sense of humor, that yes, we are all a little bit crazy, a little bit mad at points in areas. There is no such thing as a fully mature, fully sane human being. Flexible accommodation with our darker sides is often a sign that we've taken the first steps towards understanding who we really are. I think many people who face mental challenges want a feeling that once they've worked through them, they'll be forever okay. They won't have to go back to those slightly dark places they've come from. I think it's really helpful to think that problems may always return. Think of your mind a little bit like the sky. The sky is never without clouds for too long. And be ready for it. Ready for the fact that our minds are incredibly complicated. We're wrestling with huge challenges. Sometimes we grow more brittle, more fragile than we need to be, because we imagine that there is some state called mental health, mental well-being, happiness that we can reach. And once we're there, we'll never have to go back to something more vulnerable, something more painful. I think that's setting ourselves up for problems later on. Because if you expect to be well always, you'll be frightened when inevitably moments of unwellness come. And I think one of the absolutely key ways in which we start to undertake a therapeutic journey is to be prepared to feel uncomfortable. We're running away from encounters with those sides of ourselves. And that running away exerts a huge price, a huge toll on us. When we can bear to sit with some slightly uncomfortable feelings and dare to take on board some pretty awkward thoughts like, I might be in the wrong job, I might be in the wrong relationship. The insights are likely to be quite puzzling and quite personal. The point is, the more you can sit with an uncomfortable feeling, the closer you'll be to becoming an explorer of yourself. Thanks for watching. You can get my book, A Therapeutic Journey, by clicking on the link below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.